The richest people in the room are often the poorest at recognizing dignity. Rain slid slowly down the floor-to-ceiling windows of Whitmore House, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, blurring the city lights into streaks of gold and silver. Inside, crystal glasses clinked softly beneath chandeliers imported from Paris, while a piano played low enough to sound like a secret. Clara Whitmore adjusted the sleeve of her black uniform and lifted a tray of champagne with steady hands. No jewelry. No designer heels. No hint that her last name was printed discreetly across the front entrance in polished brass downstairs. To everyone in the restaurant tonight, she was just another waitress. And she preferred it that way. Table 12 just arrived, the manager whispered nervously as he passed her near the wine display. Nathaniel Hayes. Big investors. Don't make mistakes tonight. Clara gave a small nod. She had heard the name before. Everyone in Manhattan had. Billionaire investor. Ruthless negotiator. Famous for buying failing companies and rebuilding them into empires. Also famous for humiliating people who couldn't keep up with him. The front doors opened and Nathaniel Hayes walked in surrounded by expensive cologne, tailored suits, and the quiet confidence of a man who had never once doubted his own importance. At 38, he looked exactly like the magazines described him. Sharp jawline. Dark tailored overcoat still wet from the rain. A silver watch gleaming beneath the cuff of his navy suit. The kind of man who never looked around because he expected the room to look at him first. Clara approached the table with menus balanced carefully against one arm. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said calmly. "Welcome to Whitmore House." Nathaniel barely looked up from his phone. "Sparkling water," he muttered. Then his eyes lifted briefly toward her face. Something in her expression paused him for half a second. Not beauty exactly, though she was beautiful in a quiet, effortless way. It was composure. Most servers became nervous around powerful clients. She didn't. One of the French investors beside him chuckled softly and switched languages. "Finally," the man said in French, loud enough for the table to hear. "Maybe somewhere in this city understands sophistication." Nathaniel smirked faintly before replying in fluent French himself. "Fast. Sharp. Deliberate. I doubt the waitress will understand enough to embarrass herself." A few men around the table laughed under their breath. Clara remained still. The piano continued playing somewhere behind her. Rain tapped gently against the glass. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, clearly amused with himself now. "Tell the chef I want the filet medium rare," he continued in French, "and perhaps a wine list that costs more than her monthly salary." More laughter. Clara slowly placed the water glass beside him. Then, without changing her expression, she answered in perfect Parisian French. "The chef recommends the Bordeaux reduction tonight, monsieur. And for the wine." She glanced briefly toward the unopened menu in his hand. "The 1989 Chateau Margaux pairs far better with filet than the Burgundy you almost ordered." Silence. Complete silence. Nathaniel's smile disappeared instantly. One investor lowered his glass halfway to the table. Another stared openly at Clara now. But she wasn't finished. Her blue eyes moved calmly toward the French businessman sitting beside Nathaniel. "And for your discussion about the acquisition," she added softly in French, "you may want to know your translator misunderstood the legal clause regarding European distribution rights." The man's face lost color. Nathaniel slowly lowered his phone onto the white tablecloth. For the first time that evening, he looked at Clara Whitmore as if she were someone impossible to ignore. The silence around table 12 felt heavier than the rain outside. Nathaniel Hayes stared at Clara as if the entire room had shifted beneath him. The investors exchanged uneasy glances, suddenly far less confident than they had been 60 seconds earlier. Clara remained calm. One hand rested lightly against the silver water pitcher beside her. The other held the leather wine list against her waist. No smug smile. No satisfaction. Just quiet composure. The French investor cleared his throat first. "What exactly was mistranslated?" he asked carefully in French. Clara turned toward him politely. "Section 4 of the distribution contract," she explained. "Your legal team intended to request temporary exclusivity in Southern Europe for 18 months. But your translator mistakenly used wording that implied permanent ownership rights." The older man's expression tightened immediately. Another investor grabbed the paperwork from the center of the table and began scanning the pages again. Nathaniel slowly leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed entirely on Clara now. "You read corporate contracts too?" he asked in English, his voice lower than before. Clara gave a small shrug. "Only when people discuss them loudly in public dining rooms." One of the businessmen let out an awkward laugh that quickly disappeared when Nathaniel did not react. The billionaire's jaw tightened slightly instead. Not from anger. From something far less comfortable. Embarrassment. Clara reached for the unopened wine menu beside him. "You almost selected the 1996 Burgundy because of the label," she said softly. "But the kitchen changed the reduction sauce tonight. The Bordeaux is balanced better for the acidity." Nathaniel narrowed his eyes. "You memorized the menu?" "No," Clara replied. "I helped create it." That answer landed differently. Quiet. Simple. But strange enough to shift the energy at the table again. Nathaniel studied her more carefully now. The smooth confidence in her voice. The way she never apologized before speaking. The way the staff subtly watched her whenever she crossed the room. None of it matched the image in his head of a struggling waitress working double shifts for rent money. Across the restaurant, a waiter carrying champagne paused briefly near the kitchen entrance. "Is that Clara?" he whispered to another employee. She corrected Nathaniel Hayes in French. "Again?" the other server muttered under his breath. Clara ignored them both. She poured sparkling water into Nathaniel's glass with steady hands, while the billionaire watched her every movement. "Where did you learn French?" he asked finally. "Paris. College. Life." Nathaniel almost smiled at that answer. Almost. But curiosity had already replaced arrogance in his expression now. Dangerous curiosity. The kind that built billion-dollar companies. Clara sensed it immediately. Men like Nathaniel Hayes were not used to mysteries they could not instantly solve. "You seem surprised," she said calmly. "Most people are. Most waitresses do not correct international legal terminology during dinner service. Most billionaires do not mock strangers in two languages before appetizers arrive." One of the investors choked softly on his wine, trying not to laugh. Nathaniel's eyes lifted sharply toward Clara again. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of reacting with anger, he laughed quietly. Real laughter this time. Brief. Surprised. Human. The piano continued playing somewhere near the bar as thunder rolled softly outside over Manhattan. Nathaniel rested one arm against the table and looked at her differently now. Less like staff. More like a puzzle. "Tell me something honestly," he said. "What exactly are you doing working here?" Clara held his gaze for one long second. Then she answered with a calmness that somehow unsettled him even more. "Watching people." Clara walked away before Nathaniel could answer, her black heels moving quietly across the marble floor, while conversation slowly returned around the restaurant. But something had changed. People were watching her now. Not casually. Carefully. Nathaniel sat motionless for several seconds, fingers resting against the rim of his untouched water glass. Across from him, one of the investors adjusted his tie awkwardly. "Well," the man muttered with a nervous smile. "That was unexpected." Nathaniel did not respond immediately. His eyes followed Clara instead as she disappeared through the swinging kitchen doors. "Find out who she is," he said finally to his assistant beside him. "Sir." "The waitress." His assistant blinked. "You want a background report?" Nathaniel leaned back slowly in his chair. "I want to know why someone who understands French legal terminology is serving wine on a Friday night." Meanwhile, inside the kitchen, the noise of clattering pans and rushing staff filled the air with controlled chaos. Clara calmly placed the empty water pitcher onto the counter while one of the younger servers rushed toward her wide-eyed. "You embarrassed Nathaniel Hayes in front of his investors," the girl whispered. "No," Clara replied quietly as she adjusted the cuff of her sleeve. "He embarrassed himself." The older chef near the stove looked over with a faint smile hidden beneath his gray beard. "Your father is going to hear about this in 5 minutes." Clara sighed softly. "That is exactly what I was trying to avoid." "Too late now." The chef nodded toward the dining room. "Half the restaurant is talking about you." Clara glanced through the small kitchen window toward table 12 again. Nathaniel was still staring toward the back hallway instead of reviewing his business documents. Curious men were dangerous. Wealthy curious men were worse. Upstairs, somewhere above the restaurant, soft jazz echoed faintly from the private office level where her father usually handled investors and executives. Clara had spent most of her life avoiding that world. Expensive suits, artificial smiles, conversations that sounded polished but hollow. Downstairs felt more honest. People revealed themselves to waiters in ways they never would to equals. The kitchen door pushed open suddenly. Nathaniel Hayes himself stepped inside. Several cooks immediately froze mid-conversation. One dropped a spoon loudly into the sink. Nathaniel ignored everyone except Clara. Up close, the billionaire seemed even taller beneath the harsh kitchen lighting. Less polished. More real. Rainwater still darkened the shoulders of his expensive coat. "I do not usually follow waitresses into kitchens," he said calmly. Clara grabbed a clean towel and continued polishing wine glasses without looking up. "That is reassuring." Nathaniel almost smiled again. "You enjoy making people uncomfortable, do you?" "Only arrogant people." "And you decided I qualified?" Clara finally lifted her eyes toward him. "You mock someone serving your dinner because you assumed she was beneath you." Nathaniel opened his mouth to respond, then stopped. As she was right. The silence stretched between them while cooks pretended not to listen. Somewhere near the stove, butter hissed against a hot pan. Finally Nathaniel exhaled quietly. "Fair enough." Clara blinked once. Most powerful men defended themselves immediately. Apologies were rare. Honest ones even rarer. Nathaniel glanced around the kitchen slowly. "This place runs differently when you are in the room," he observed. "People listen to you." "People listen when you respect them," Clara answered. Nathaniel studied her face carefully now. Not flirtation. Not amusement. Recognition. As if he was slowly realizing the woman standing beside the kitchen counter was nothing like the story he had created in his head. Then the kitchen manager hurried inside looking pale. "Miss Whitmore," he said nervously. "Your father just arrived downstairs." The entire kitchen fell silent again. Nathaniel's expression changed instantly. For one brief second, Nathaniel Hayes looked genuinely uncertain. Not confused. Uncertain. The kind of expression powerful men rarely showed because they spent their entire lives controlling rooms before anyone else had the chance. But now the room had changed without his permission. "Whitmore," he repeated slowly. Clara said nothing. The kitchen manager immediately straightened his posture. Even the cooks became quieter, moving with sudden precision as footsteps echoed faintly from the hallway outside. Then the kitchen doors opened again. Richard Whitmore entered without raising his voice, yet the atmosphere shifted instantly around him. At 62, the owner of Whitmore House carried himself with the calm authority of someone who no longer needed to prove anything. Silver hair. Tailored charcoal suit. A watch older than most luxury cars. He glanced once around the kitchen before his eyes landed on Clara. "There you are," he said warmly. "Your mother has been calling me for 20 minutes asking why you are still downstairs." Clara sighed softly. "I was working." "You were hiding," Richard corrected gently. Then his attention moved toward Nathaniel. Recognition flashed immediately. "Mr. Hayes," Richard said politely. "I did not realize you were dining with us tonight." Nathaniel recovered quickly, extending his hand with practiced confidence. "Mr. Whitmore. Good to finally meet you." But something subtle had already disappeared from his tone. Some of the arrogance. Richard shook his hand once before glancing back toward Clara again. "You are still wearing the service uniform," he observed. "That was the plan," Clara replied. Richard smiled faintly. Clearly not a successful one. Nathaniel looked between them carefully now, pieces slowly connecting inside his mind. The mysterious waitress. The confidence. The knowledge. The way the staff treated her differently. Suddenly every strange detail made sense. Clara Whitmore was not pretending to belong in the restaurant. She belonged to it more than anyone else in the building. "Your daughter has an extraordinary understanding of French business law," Nathaniel said carefully. Richard's expression barely changed. "She should," he replied. "She helped negotiate our European expansion 3 years ago." Silence again. Nathaniel blinked once. Clara looked almost annoyed now, as if she disliked the conversation entirely. Dad. Richard lifted one hand apologetically. What? He was going to find out eventually. Nathaniel stared at Clara differently now. Not with curiosity anymore. With respect. Real respect. The kind built from surprise and discomfort mixed together. You negotiated international contracts? He asked. Clara folded the towel slowly in her hands. Among other things. While working as a waitress? While learning how this restaurant actually functions. Richard leaned casually against the counter nearby. Most heirs learn business from boardrooms, he said quietly. Clara insisted on learning from dishwashers, servers, hosts, bartenders, and cooks first. Nathaniel glanced around the kitchen. Suddenly the details became impossible to ignore. The staff trusted her. The chef listened when she spoke. Even the manager looked nervous around her. Not because of wealth. Because of respect earned over time. You let people think you were poor, Nathaniel said carefully. Clara met his eyes calmly. No. I let people reveal who they are. The words landed harder than Nathaniel expected, because he knew exactly what she meant. He remembered every sentence he had spoken at that table earlier. Every arrogant joke. Every dismissive glance. The rain outside grew heavier against the windows as thunder rolled softly over Manhattan again. Somewhere in the dining room, the piano player shifted into a slower melody. Richard checked his watch. The investors upstairs are waiting, he said to Clara. Your mother wants your opinion before signing tomorrow's acquisition. Nathaniel frowned immediately. You are involved in the acquisition? Clara slid the folded towel onto the counter. It is my acquisition. And for the second time that night, Nathaniel Hayes found himself completely speechless. The kitchen suddenly felt too small for the silence that followed. Nathaniel Hayes stood motionless beneath the harsh overhead lights while Clara removed the black apron from around her waist with calm, practiced movements. No dramatic reveal. No satisfaction in her expression. If anything, she looked tired. Richard Whitmore adjusted the cuff of his suit and glanced briefly toward his daughter. The investors are upstairs, he reminded her gently. Your mother refuses to sign anything without you reading the final numbers. Clara folded the apron once and handed it to a nearby server. Give this to Emily for tomorrow's shift, she said softly. The young waitress took it carefully like it suddenly carried more importance than fabric should. Nathaniel watched the exchange closely. Everything about Clara made more sense now, and somehow less sense at the same time. Most wealthy heirs he knew spent fortunes trying to appear important. Clara Whitmore had spent the entire evening hiding it. Richard gave Nathaniel a polite nod before heading back toward the hallway. You are welcome upstairs after dinner if you wish to discuss the acquisition, he offered professionally. Though I suspect my daughter will ask harder questions than I do. A faint smile touched his face before he disappeared through the swinging doors. The kitchen slowly returned to motion again. Pans hissed. Staff resumed speaking quietly. But Nathaniel remained where he was, eyes fixed on Clara. You let me believe you were struggling to pay rent, he said finally. Clara reached for a silver tray near the counter. I never said that. You let everyone think you were just another server. I am another server. Nathaniel frowned slightly. No, you are not. Clara looked at him directly then. Calm blue eyes. Impossible to read. That is exactly the problem, she replied softly. People decide what respect looks like before they know who deserves it. Nathaniel had negotiated billion-dollar deals in rooms filled with politicians, executives, and international investors. Very few people unsettled him anymore. Clara Whitmore unsettled him constantly. Because every sentence she spoke forced him to hear himself differently. One of the younger cooks rushed past carrying fresh plates toward the dining room. Careful with table 8, Clara reminded him automatically. The woman near the window has a shellfish allergy. Already changed the garnish, the cook replied immediately. Nathaniel noticed the exchange. She was not performing authority. She had earned it. Quietly. Over time. Clara picked up another tray and started toward the kitchen doors again. Nathaniel stepped slightly into her path without thinking. Wait. She paused. What? For the first time all evening, Nathaniel seemed unsure what to say next. Rain continued sliding against the windows outside, while distant thunder softened into a low rumble above the city skyline. "Why work downstairs at all?" he asked finally. "You could have walked into any boardroom in Manhattan." Clara considered the question for a moment. Then she glanced toward the dining room where servers moved carefully between crystal glasses and candlelight. "Boardrooms teach strategy," she said quietly. "Restaurants teach character." Nathaniel said nothing. Clara continued. "You learn everything about people when they think the person serving them does not matter." The words hit harder now because Nathaniel knew exactly what kind of man he had been 3 hours earlier. Clara pushed open the kitchen doors and stepped back into the dining room. But this time the room reacted differently. Staff straightened slightly when she passed. Managers nodded respectfully. Even wealthy guests glanced toward her with curiosity after hearing whispers spread across the restaurant. Nathaniel followed several steps behind, suddenly aware of how loud confidence could sound when it came from money alone. Near the piano, Clara stopped beside an elderly dishwasher carrying a heavy bus tub toward the back hallway. Without hesitation, she set down her tray and helped him carry it herself. The old man smiled gratefully. "Thank you, Miss Whitmore." Clara smiled back softly. "You carried me through 3 summers when I was 16, she replied. "I think I can handle a few dishes." Nathaniel watched the moment in silence. And for the first time in years, the billionaire began questioning whether he had spent his entire life misunderstanding what real class actually looked like. By the time dessert service began, the atmosphere inside Whitmore House had changed completely. Conversation still floated beneath the chandeliers. Crystal glasses still clinked softly against white linen tablecloths. The piano still moved gently through the dining room like rain against glass. But now people were watching Clara Whitmore differently. Word traveled quickly in places built on status, especially when powerful people were embarrassed. Nathaniel remained at table 12 long after his investors finished discussing contracts. 2 men had already left for the valet downstairs. Another stepped away to answer calls near the bar. Yet Nathaniel stayed seated alone, one hand resting against a glass of untouched Bordeaux, while his attention drifted repeatedly toward Clara moving through the restaurant. She never slowed down, never acted important. At one point he watched her kneel beside a nervous new waitress who had accidentally entered the wrong wine order. Instead of scolding her, Clara quietly showed her how to correct the mistake without embarrassing the customer. A few minutes later she carried fresh coffee herself to an elderly couple celebrating their 50th anniversary near the windows. She knew their names, their usual dessert order, even the husband's preference for 2 sugar packets instead of 1. Nathaniel noticed everything now. The respect people gave Clara had nothing to do with her father's money. It came from how she made people feel when she spoke to them. "You are staring," one of his investors muttered with amusement as he returned to the table. Nathaniel barely looked up. "I am observing the waitress." Nathaniel's eyes shifted briefly toward him. The woman running this entire restaurant without needing anyone to announce it. The investor chuckled softly. "You like her?" "No," Nathaniel replied immediately. Then he paused. "I respect her." Somehow that felt more dangerous. Across the dining room, Clara disappeared briefly through the hallway leading upstairs toward the private executive floor. Nathaniel watched the door close behind her. Curiosity pulled at him again. But underneath it now sat something heavier. Regret. He replayed the beginning of the evening in his mind with uncomfortable clarity. His mocking tone. The laughter at the table. The assumption that intelligence could not exist beneath a service uniform. For perhaps the first time in years, Nathaniel Hayes felt ashamed of the first impression he had made on someone. A server approached quietly beside him. "Mr. Hayes," the young man said carefully, "Miss Whitmore asked me to bring this." Nathaniel looked down. A small handwritten note rested beside the wine glass. Simple white stationery. Elegant handwriting. The investors misunderstood Section 4 because the translator ignored regional legal phrasing from Marseille. The revised wording is attached. Also, the Bordeaux improves after 8 minutes. Nathaniel stared at the note for several seconds before noticing the additional pages clipped beneath it. Clara had corrected the entire contract herself. Quietly, without asking for credit. One of the investors leaned closer. She fixed this already? Nathaniel nodded slowly. Hours before our legal team would have noticed. The investor gave a low whistle beneath his breath. And she was serving appetizers an hour ago. Nathaniel folded the note carefully. Something about the gesture unsettled him more than if Clara had openly humiliated him. She had every reason to expose him publicly. Instead, she solved his problem and walked away without demanding recognition. That kind of confidence could not be purchased. Near the staircase upstairs, Clara finally reappeared wearing a fitted ivory blazer over her black dress instead of the waitress uniform. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. Suddenly she looked less like staff and more like the executive she had always been. Several investors upstairs greeted her immediately as she crossed the balcony overlooking the restaurant. Nathaniel looked up just as Clara paused briefly at the railing above the dining room. Their eyes met across the distance. Neither smiled. Yet something passed silently between them anyway. Respect. Real respect. Then Clara disappeared into the private conference room upstairs while Nathaniel sat alone beneath the chandeliers, realizing the most unforgettable person he had met in years was never pretending to be powerful. She simply never needed to prove it. Nearly an hour passed before the private conference room upstairs finally opened again. The investors emerged first, speaking in low, impressed voices while assistants hurried behind them carrying folders and tablets. Through the glass balcony overlooking the dining room, Clara remained near the long conference table beside her parents, reviewing final paperwork beneath soft amber lighting. Nathaniel watched from below without touching the coffee growing cold beside his hand. One of his investors leaned back in his chair and shook his head slowly. "She caught a 7-figure legal mistake in under 2 minutes, the man muttered. "Do you realize what that could have cost us?" Nathaniel did realize. That was the problem. His entire career had been built on reading intelligence quickly, spotting weakness faster than competitors. Yet somehow he had looked directly at Clara Whitmore and mistaken grace for simplicity. Upstairs, Clara finally signed the final page and closed the folder. Richard Whitmore smiled proudly while her mother touched her arm gently before the executives slowly dispersed toward the elevators. Clara remained alone for a moment near the balcony rail overlooking the restaurant below. The piano player had moved into a softer melody now. Rain still painted silver streaks down the windows behind Nathaniel. Their eyes met again across the distance. This time Clara gave a slight nod before turning toward the staircase. Minutes later she stepped back onto the main floor, no longer wearing the blazer from upstairs. She had changed back into the simple black waitress uniform. Nathaniel stood immediately when she approached his table. "You changed back," he observed quietly. Clara glanced down briefly at the uniform. "I still have tables assigned to me." Nathaniel let out a soft breath that almost sounded like disbelief. "You negotiate acquisitions upstairs and refill coffee downstairs in the same night. Both matter." She reached for the untouched dessert menu beside his plate. "Most people only notice one of them." Nathaniel watched her carefully. "And which one tells you more about a person?" Clara answered without hesitation. "How they treat someone carrying the coffee." The words settled between them quietly. Sharp without cruelty. Honest without drama. Nathaniel lowered his eyes briefly toward the tablecloth before speaking again. "I owe you an apology." Clara said nothing. "Not because you are Richard Whitmore's daughter," he continued carefully. "And not because you saved my deal tonight." He paused. "Because I spoke to you like your job determined your worth." Clara studied him for several seconds, long enough to make him uncomfortable. "Most people do," she replied softly. "That does not make it acceptable." Nathaniel nodded once. Somewhere near the entrance, a valet opened the doors for departing guests while cold Manhattan air drifted briefly into the restaurant. "You know what bothers me most?" Nathaniel asked quietly. Clara waited. He gave a faint humorless smile. "I actually believed I was sophisticated." For the first time all evening Clara almost laughed. Not mockingly. Gently. "Speaking French does not make someone cultured, Mr. Hayes." "Apparently not. Neither does money." Nathaniel leaned slightly against the back of his chair, studying her face beneath the warm chandelier light. "Then what does?" Clara glanced around the restaurant. At the dishwasher collecting plates carefully near the kitchen entrance. At the nervous young waitress learning table numbers beside the hostess stand. At the elderly couple smiling over shared cheesecake near the windows. "How quietly you treat people when nobody important is watching," she answered. Nathaniel felt the truth of that sentence immediately because he realized something uncomfortable. Clara had seen him at his worst before she ever saw him at his best. Most people in his world only experience the polished version of Nathaniel Hayes. The billionaire. The investor. The man on magazine covers. Clara had met the arrogant stranger beneath all of it first. A silence settled comfortably between them this time. Different from before. Softer. Then Clara picked up the check folder from the table and placed it gently beside him. "Your investors already left," she said. "But you stayed." Nathaniel looked up at her. "So did you." Clara held his gaze for one long quiet moment while rain shimmered against the Manhattan skyline behind them. Then she spoke so softly he almost missed it. "Maybe we were both still trying to understand something." The restaurant had nearly emptied by midnight. Candle flames flickered lower across the white tablecloths while servers quietly reset silverware for the next afternoon. Outside, Manhattan glistened beneath rain-soaked streets and blurred taxi lights. Nathaniel Hayes remained seated near the window long after the last investors disappeared into the elevators. Clara stood beside the espresso station reviewing closing reports on a tablet, her expression calm beneath the soft amber glow hanging above the bar. The black waitress uniform still looked strangely natural on her, even after everything he had learned upstairs. Nathaniel watched her for another silent moment before finally walking toward the counter. "Do you ever stop working?" he asked quietly. Clara looked up from the screen. "Do you?" He almost smiled at that. "Fair point." She closed the tablet and set it aside. "The kitchen closes in 10 minutes. I am not here for dinner anymore." Clara leaned lightly against the marble counter. "Then what are you here for?" Nathaniel hesitated. The answer should have been simple. Men like him always had answers ready. But something about Clara dismantled his usual certainty piece by piece. "I think," he said slowly, "I am trying to figure out when exactly tonight I became the least impressive person in the room." Clara laughed softly this time. Real laughter. Quiet enough that it almost disappeared beneath the piano music. "That sounds difficult for you." "Extremely." The honesty surprised them both. A young busboy hurried past carrying stacked glasses toward the kitchen. One slipped dangerously near the edge of the tray. Nathaniel instinctively reached forward to steady it before it crashed onto the marble floor. The busboy blinked in surprise. "Thank you, sir." Nathaniel nodded awkwardly. The boy hurried away. Clara noticed immediately. "That is new," she observed. "What?" "You noticed the person carrying the tray." Nathaniel glanced toward the kitchen hallway where the busboy had disappeared. "I suppose I am learning." Clara studied him quietly for a moment. Something softer had entered her expression now. Not admiration. Not forgiveness. Understanding, perhaps. "Most people with money stop seeing small things," she said gently. "They become surrounded by people who remove inconvenience before they ever notice it exists." Nathaniel leaned one hand against the counter beside her. "And you?" Clara looked around the nearly empty restaurant. "I grew up watching my father treat every dishwasher like a business partner." Her eyes drifted toward the old man cleaning glasses near the back wall. "He always said restaurants fail the moment owners believe they are more important than the people carrying the plates." Nathaniel followed her gaze silently. "Your father is a smarter man than most executives I know. That is because he spent 30 years listening instead of talking." The words lingered quietly between them while rain tapped gently against the windows. Somewhere upstairs, a door closed softly on the executive floor. Nathaniel loosened his tie slightly for the first time all evening. He suddenly looked less like the billionaire from magazine covers, and more like an exhausted man sitting alone after a very long day. Clara noticed that too. "You know," she said carefully, "when you first walked in tonight, everyone in the restaurant became nervous." Nathaniel frowned faintly. "That bad?" "Worse." He exhaled quietly through his nose. "I spent years believing intimidation meant respect." Clara tilted her head slightly. "And now?" Nathaniel looked directly at her. "Now I think respect might be quieter than that." Neither spoke for several seconds after. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt honest. Finally, Clara reached beneath the counter and placed a small white box in front of him. Nathaniel looked down. "What is this?" "Chocolate espresso cake," she replied. The kitchen was throwing it away because it was slightly uneven. Nathaniel opened the box slowly. "You are giving dessert to the man who insulted you?" Clara met his eyes calmly. "No," she said softly. "I am giving dessert to the man who apologized." Nathaniel stared at her for one long moment beneath the warm restaurant lights. Then, for the first time in years, the billionaire found himself completely unable to think of anything clever to say. The rain had finally stopped by the time Nathaniel Hayes stepped outside Whitmore House. Manhattan shimmered beneath fresh midnight reflections, streetlights stretching across wet pavement like liquid gold. Behind him, staff members quietly locked the restaurant doors while the final piano notes faded into silence. Nathaniel paused near the curb, the small white dessert box still resting in his hands. Strange. He had closed billion-dollar deals with less emotion than he felt carrying a slightly uneven piece of chocolate cake through the streets of New York. His driver hurried toward him with an umbrella. "Home, sir." Nathaniel glanced back once toward the glowing windows of the restaurant above. Through the glass he could still see Clara moving inside near the bar, helping stack menus beside two exhausted servers. Not because she had to, because she stayed until everyone else finished. "No," Nathaniel said quietly. "Take me to the office." The driver looked surprised but nodded. Inside the car, Nathaniel loosened his tie completely and stared out the window during the silent drive downtown. Usually after negotiations his mind focused immediately on numbers, acquisitions, and strategy. Tonight he could only hear Clara's voice repeating softly in his head. People decide what respect looks like before they know who deserves it. He thought about the busboy carrying glasses, the dishwasher Clara thanked by name, the frightened young waitress she quietly protected from embarrassment. Small moments. Invisible moments. Yet somehow more meaningful than most conversations happening inside corporate towers every day. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Nathaniel sat alone in his office overlooking Manhattan. The city lights glowed cold against the glass walls while financial reports covered the conference table untouched. Instead, the billionaire opened his laptop and searched Whitmore House. Articles appeared immediately. Luxury dining empire. European expansion. Family-owned hospitality group valued at nearly $900 million. Then another headline caught his attention. Whitmore Hospitality quietly funds culinary scholarships for low-income students. Nathaniel frowned slightly and clicked the article open. There was no press conference. No publicity campaign. Just a small interview from years earlier where Richard Whitmore explained why the company paid college tuition for employees who wanted careers beyond restaurant work. Nathaniel leaned back slowly in his chair. Quiet generosity. Again. The entire Whitmore family seemed allergic to showing off. His phone buzzed suddenly against the desk. One of his investors. "I just reviewed the corrected contract," the man said immediately. "Clara Whitmore saved us at least $40 million tonight." Nathaniel stared at the skyline outside his office window. "I know. Honestly, Hayes, I have never seen you speechless before." Nathaniel gave a faint smile to himself. "Neither have I." After the call ended, silence filled the office again. Nathaniel looked down toward the small dessert box still sitting unopened beside his laptop. Slowly he lifted the lid. The chocolate espresso cake inside was slightly uneven, exactly as Clara said. Imperfect. Handmade. Real. A folded napkin rested beneath it. Nathaniel unfolded it carefully. One sentence written in elegant handwriting waited inside. "Some people speak 5 languages and still never learn respect." Nathaniel stared at the words for a long time. Then something unexpected happened. He laughed quietly to himself. Not offended. Grateful. Because for the first time in years, someone had looked directly past the billionaire, past the expensive suit, past the polished reputation, and spoken honestly to the man underneath all of it. Downstairs, 20 stories below his office, hundreds of people hurried through Manhattan without ever knowing that one dinner inside a restaurant had changed something fundamental in a man who thought money had already taught him everything worth learning. But Clara Whitmore never raised her voice that night. She never tried to embarrass him. She simply raised the standard. And somehow that was far more unforgettable.